MELES ZENAWI, Part 2, The Mind, Vision, and Developmental Legacy of an African Leader by
ILA
ILA
Shishai.
Shishai.
Number
Number
6,
6, Strategy
Strategy
3,
3,
Human
Human
Capital.
Capital. Meles Zenawi, Part 2, The Mind, Vision, and Developmental Legacy of an African Leader by Haile A. Shishay. 6. Strategy 3, Human Capital. Meles understood that roads and dams alone cannot transform a country. People must also be transformed. Education therefore became a major national priority. School enrollment expanded dramatically. Health services were taken deeper into rural Ethiopia. The health extension program became one of the most important examples of Ethiopia's attempt to deliver basic health care to rural communities. Research on Ethiopia's Millennium Development Goal achievements documented dramatic expansion in health posts, health centers, and trained health extension workers. The UNDP's assessment of Ethiopia's development during this period also reported major improvements in education, health coverage, roads, and access to potable water. The 2012 MDG report stated that more than 65% of public expenditure was directed toward pro-poor sectors, including education, water, health, agriculture, roads, and energy. That is a critical lesson for Africa. A country does not become rich simply by extracting resources. It becomes powerful by developing people. Strategy 4, long-term planning. Another characteristic of Meles's leadership was his emphasis on long-term planning. Rather than governing entirely from election to election, the Ethiopian government developed multi-year development frameworks. The Sustainable Development and Poverty Reduction Program was followed by PASTI, and then the Growth and Transformation Plan. The objective was to create continuity between government policy, public investment, and national development. This approach reflected a central principle of Meles's thinking. Development requires patience. A nation cannot be transformed in one election cycle. A generation must sometimes build what another generation will enjoy. Number 8. Strategy 5, the developmental state. Perhaps Meles's greatest intellectual contribution was his attempt to formulate an African version of the developmental state. His central proposition was relatively simple. Poor countries cannot necessarily develop by leaving everything to the market. The state must sometimes coordinate investment. It must build infrastructure. It must invest in human capital. It must create conditions for industrialization. It must support structural transformation. The World Bank itself described Ethiopia's model as a developmental state approach involving a strong government role and high public investment. Meles therefore attempted to build a state capable of thinking decades ahead. This is where his political philosophy becomes relevant beyond Ethiopia. He was not merely asking, what policy will make people happy today? He was asking, what must Ethiopia build today so that its children can live differently tomorrow? That is the mentality of a nation builder. Number 9, the renaissance of Ethiopian infrastructure. The developmental program produced visible changes. Roads expanded, schools expanded, health facilities expanded. Electricity generation became a strategic national project. Large hydroelectric projects became central to the country's ambition to transform Ethiopia from an energy-poor economy into a major electricity producer. The dam building program was not merely about electricity. It was connected to a broader vision of industrialization and structural transformation. Academic research describes electricity as central to the EPRDF's developmental project. This was Meles thinking several steps ahead. Electricity leads to industry. Industry creates employment. Employment increases income. Income increases demand. Demand creates markets. Markets encourage further investment. That is how development becomes a cycle rather than a collection of isolated projects. Number 10, Ethiopia's progress toward the Millennium Development Goals. The transformation was not limited to GDP. Ethiopia made significant progress toward the Millennium Development Goals. The 2012 UNDP report stated that 6 of the 8 MDGs were already on track and that more than 65% of public expenditure was directed toward sectors directly connected to poverty reduction and human development. The World Bank also documented improvements in life expectancy, education, child mortality, access to water, electricity, rural services, agricultural productivity, and poverty reduction. The World Bank reported that household living standards improved substantially between 2000 and 2011, and that life expectancy increased during the same period. This is why MELES' economic legacy remains an important subject of academic study. Number 11, MELES ZENAWI in Africa. MELES eventually became much more than Ethiopia's prime minister. He became one of Africa's most prominent voices internationally. The Center for Strategic and International Studies described him as an exceptionally intelligent and articulate leader who became an unofficial spokesman for Africa and a frequent participant in G8 and G20 discussions. He represented African interests in international discussions on development, climate change, poverty, trade, financing, food security, and global governance. His international influence became particularly visible during climate negotiations. Number 12, the African climate voice. MELES played a major role in developing a common African position on climate change. In the lead up to the Copenhagen climate negotiations in 2009, he spoke of African countries negotiating through a unified African position. The UN's Africa Renewal documented his role in helping African states develop a common negotiating position. This was significant. Africa's problem was not simply climate change. Africa's problem was that individual African states often had limited bargaining power. MELES understood the power of collective negotiation. His approach was, Africa should not arrive at the international negotiating table as dozens of weak voices. Africa should arrive as one continent with a common position. That was strategic diplomacy. Number 13, MELES and international recognition. MELES developed relationships with leaders across the world. U.S. President Barack Obama, following MELES' death, explicitly recognized his contribution to Ethiopia's development, particularly his commitment to Ethiopia's poor. Obama also praised MELES' contributions to peace and security in Africa, his work with the African Union, and his role as a voice for Africa internationally. That statement is historically significant because it came from a major international leader who had worked directly with him. MELES had become an important interlocutor between Africa and the international system. Number 14, MELES and African diplomacy. MELES also played important roles in regional diplomacy. He became involved in efforts concerning Sudan and South Sudan. He was influential in regional security affairs. Ethiopia became an important actor in the Horn of Africa. His government also intervened militarily in Somalia in 2006 against the Islamic Courts Union. This was a controversial decision. Nevertheless, it established Ethiopia as one of the principal regional security actors. His government subsequently became a major security partner for Western countries. This international role had benefits for Ethiopia, but it also generated controversy. The lesson for young leaders is not that every decision MELES made was correct. The lesson is that African states need leaders capable of understanding regional geopolitics rather than merely reacting to it. Number 15, the intellectual MELES. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of MELES was that he was not satisfied with simply governing. He wanted to understand why African development had failed. His writings explored political economy, state capacity, markets, structural transformation, industrialization, globalization, African development, inequality, and governance. His African development, dead ends and new beginnings, is especially important because it reveals the intellectual architecture behind his development philosophy. Academic researchers have subsequently studied what has become known as MELES ZENAWI's developmental state and the intellectual theory behind Ethiopia's development model. And this is perhaps the most important message for young Africans. Do not be satisfied with becoming a politician. Become a thinker. Study economics, study history, study science, study technology, understand geopolitics, understand your people, then lead. End of part 2. Part 3 begins with section 16, the other side of the